I wanted to kick off by asking you about the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which, of course, has been the subject of a lot of robust public debate over the last, I guess, 2 years since it came out in 2019. And you were one of 5 signatories on a letter to the New York Times kind of at the start of the debate, which sort of kicked off a lot of the discussion. And I wanted to ask you about that in particular, because one of your co-signatories, Sean Wilentz, recently had a great longer piece kind of discussing, some of his misgivings and concerns about the 1619 Project. And in that piece, he talked about how quite a few historians had actually been approached to assess the project and respond to it and critique it. But a lot of the historians who were approached to sign onto the letter, said something along the lines of, well, I agree with your concerns, or I have issues with the 1619 Project as well, but I'm not ready to put my name to an open letter because, of X, Y, or Z political considerations, or because I think a lot of the historians, that Wilentz mentioned, said something along the lines of like, well, I'm not so sure about some of the claims made by the 1619 Project, but it's a really important cultural event, and I don't want to be seen as, impugning the work of Black journalists, all of which I think, are legitimate and fair concerns. So just by way of beginning, can you talk a little bit about why you chose to sign the open letter to the New York Times and what kind of your main concerns with the 1619 Project are?
Wow, that's a big question. I signed the letter basically because it focused narrowly on some fairly egregious factual errors in the mostly in the introduction to the project. But my concern about factual errors lay elsewhere outside of the purview of that particular letter. They were focused primarily on the question of the relationship between slavery and the American Revolution, which the 1619 Project not only gets wrong, it gets it backward. That is, we've known for decades that the central significance of the American Revolution to the history of slavery, and New World slavery in particular, was that it was the beginning of anti-slavery politics. It's the first time you got abolition on a significant scale, and it went through one state after another. And the accumulation of those states that abolished slavery, inspired by the Revolution, is what we call the North. And it's impossible to imagine American history from the Revolution to the Civil War without a North and a South in conflict with one another repeatedly, ultimately to the point where the whole country collapses into civil war. So to get it, it's one thing to say they made a mistake when they said it was that pro-slavery defense was a primary reason for declaring your independence. It's not only was it not a primary reason, it was virtually no reason, but it as I said, it gets backwards the actual historical significance of the American Revolution for the history of slavery and anti-slavery in particular. And that is an indication of a larger problem throughout the 1619 Project, which is that it erases substantial conflicts throughout U.S. history over slavery and racism in the United States. And it does that, I think, primarily, well, for 2 reasons. First, because it's written from a vaguely Black nationalist perspective that seeks to argue that any progress African Americans have ever made, they've made largely on their own. There's no such thing as white abolitionists. There's no such thing as a Republican Party. There was no such thing as a civil rights movement that attracted millions of whites as well as Blacks. So it's erasing a history of conflict over those issues throughout American history because of that perspective, and that distorts. And the second source of its distortion was that it was written with the goal of justifying reparations. And that distorts the way they approach history too, because it not only erases white allies from the history of Black freedom struggles, it makes all whites responsible for though the various forms of oppression African Americans have suffered through the centuries, the very real oppression they've suffered. And in order to do that, in a way that I don't quite understand, the supporters of reparations seem to feel the need to argue that all white people were enriched by the oppression of blacks. And this goes flat up against a well-known understanding that slave economies inhibit economic development, restrict opportunities for whites living in the proximity of slave economies, and consigned generations of whites as well as blacks to poverty and misery. And it seems to me that a better case for reparations would be a more truthful account of the disastrous consequences of the slave economy for the United States and for the southern United States in particular. So I was particularly concerned with the factual errors in the essay by Matthew Desmond, which was all about the relationship between slavery and capitalism, and like the argument about the American Revolution, gets that relationship exactly backwards. That is, it wants to claim that all of Northern wealth was based on slavery, when it's a much stronger case to say that the entire slave economy was based on the enormous wealth and consumer demand emanating from the more advanced economies and more developed economies in England and the North at the time. There is a powerful relationship between capitalism and slavery, but it's the reverse of the one, it's close to being the reverse of the one that's posited by that essay and by the 1619 Project. So it's not just a question of getting your facts wrong, it's getting them wrong in a way that reverses some of the major findings of historians over the past several generations.
That's a perfect segue into my next question, because I was going to ask you specifically about the Desmond essay, and you answered kind of part of what I wanted to ask.
Okay.
But I suppose a follow-up to that is, what is a better way of understanding the relationship between slavery and capitalism, or the development of American capitalism? Because you just alluded to it being very important to the development of capitalism, but not in the way that Desmond lays out. So what is a better way of understanding it?
Well, to take off, it's a global issue rather than a U.S. issue. So the way capitalism and slavery operates in the United States is not quite the same, is slightly a different story from the way the relationship developed over the centuries in the Atlantic economy. So you could say we have three distinct phases in a sense. The first, slavery by the imperial powers of Portugal and Spain that inaugurate the Atlantic slave trade and bring large numbers of slaves to the Caribbean and South America, did not benefit from that development because those economies at home were backward, those were extensions of the feudal system of expansion. So after 1.5 centuries of development of activity, intense activity in the Atlantic world, the result for Spain and Portugal was economically nil in terms of its economic development. It's only when Great Britain and to some extent the Netherlands get involved in the slave trade, particularly in the 18th century, that you begin to see a connection between the development of capitalism and the Atlantic slave trading world. And there is pretty much a consensus among historians and economic historians who spent decades going over this, that the slave trade contributed something to the industrial development of Great Britain, but that it probably would have happened otherwise. That is, it would have gone slower. It might have taken a slightly different form. But here's the point. See, coming from the perspective I come from, the great debates over the transition from feudalism to capitalism that formed my understanding of this whole issue taught me that capitalism developed prior to industrialization, and it was the prior development of capitalism, particularly in England and Great Britain, but mostly in England, that led to the development of England's involvement and deep engagement in the slave trade. So in that sense, capitalism precedes Britain's major involvement in the slave trade and gives rise to both New World slave economies in the Anglo-American world and industrialization. So the development of capitalism is prior to both industrialization and British involvement in the slave trade. And then comes the United States. In the United States, the story is slightly different because industrialization doesn't happen in a significant way until the 19th century, after a century or more of having slaves in the southern colonies in particular, but every colony had slavery. And there it seems to me that it's the development of an extraordinary explosion of consumer demand emanating from the capitalist world for textiles, cotton, the goods, or, tobacco, rice, sugar, coffee. It's the consumer demand from an already developing capitalist world that is giving life and breathing new life into the slave economy. Some people call that what happened in the United States in the 19th century a second slavery, but I tend to think of it as a third slavery after the Portuguese and Spanish slavery. After the 18th century British Anglo-American slavery comes a third cotton economy that's located primarily in the American South, but again is driven by the development of capitalism. So, for example, the first textile mills go up in Rhode Island, Slater's Mills, before there is a cotton gin. It is the existence of those mills and the demand coming from the nascent northern industrial economy that causes Southerners to say, we got to figure out some way of producing our cotton more efficiently. And it's Eli Whitney comes down and produces it, but his cotton gin is patented 2 years or something like that after Slater's Mills go up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. So the relationship between capitalism and slavery is very powerful, but it varies over time. And it's mostly, by the 19th century, the capitalist economy that is driving the prosperity of the slave economies.
And so you've been very critical of a tendency that you call racial consensus history. And I think you could arguably describe the 1619 Project as that. So can you explain what you mean by racial consensus history and why is that a problem to you?
Well, it's something I did allude to in my first answer. It's the assumption that there is no conflict among whites over issues like race and slavery in the United States, which leaves us with no explanation for why slavery was abolished in the northern states after the American Revolution, why a civil war erupted over slavery. We all agree that it was caused by slavery, and why hundreds of thousands of whites were killing one another in a war that became a revolutionary war to overthrow slavery. Where does the 14th Amendment come from? Where does the 15th Amendment come from? There is abundant evidence, and we saw it last year when tens of thousands of whites marched into the streets in the middle of a pandemic to protest the outrageous murder of George Floyd. There have always been large numbers of whites divided amongst themselves in alliance with blacks and in a struggle against slavery and racial discrimination in the United States. And the 1619 Project erases that and instead posits a racial consensus among whites that is unchanging. And it uses biological metaphors to posit, or even biblical metaphors, right? That racism is, when you say racism is built into the DNA of the United States, or that it's America's original sin, those things are unchanging. DNA passes down through the generations, and original sin is reborn with every new generation, right? And it's designed to show an unchanging white racial consensus. And that to me is not just ahistorical. It's almost anti-historical. It's not the biological metaphor that's the problem. It's specifically the DNA metaphor. So we use metaphors all the time that are biological, like we say the mother country or generations. The generation of World War of 1917 or something like that, and the 60s generation. And it's all designed. They're designed to show the historical specificity of a particular moment as it was differentiated from a previous moment or from what came after. But when you say DNA or original sin, it's used in particular in the 1619 Project and elsewhere. It's designed to show something that doesn't change, a white racial consensus that's born with the United States and is with us still, so that it will not differentiate between a slave picking cotton on a Mississippi plantation in the 1850s and a tenured professor at Harvard, who, if they're both black, they're both subjected to exactly the same same white racial consensus, and nothing has fundamentally altered that. And that seems to me to be unhelpful as a way of figuring out where we are right now and what kind of politics we need at this moment.
And I want to get to the anti-slavery movement, but I mean, what you just said made me think, because even among establishment Democrats today, they often kind of use this framing of original sin in our DNA. And it kind of begs the question, I mean, if it's that hopeless,
exactly,
why vote for whatever Democratic candidate that is saying this, trying to get our vote? It's kind of ironic in that way.
I think it goes back to what I said earlier about the nationalist assumption that we're never going to get anything from white allies, so we're going to have to do this on our own. And that seems to me the logical politics that comes out of the assumption of a white racial consensus, an unchanging white racial consensus. Yes, the paradox is that if you actually believe that, as you said, then why have any politics? Right. If it hasn't changed over the course of 250 years, what makes you think you can do anything now? What makes you think hiring Robin DiAngelo to teach you to be an anti-racist is going to somehow change what a fundamental structural transformation, like the overthrow of the largest, wealthiest slave economy on earth, didn't change, right? If that's not enough to cause people to change, then seminars isn't going to do it either.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.